Poverty, a condition that exists to varying degrees in virtually every jurisdiction and society on earth. And yet, there are ways to improve conditions for even the poorest of the poor, as detailed in the Fraser Institute's annual Economic Freedom of the World report. High levels of personal choice, easy access to markets, low taxation, limited government regulation, and rule of law. In short, economic freedom. Each year, the Economic Freedom of the World report shows that countries with high levels of economic freedom experience less poverty. Let's look at the numbers, based on data from 157 countries and territories worldwide. When it comes to income, people in countries with the most economic freedom earn substantially more money than people in the least economically free countries. And in all of these countries, the amount of income earned by the poorest 10% of the population is much higher in countries with greater levels of economic freedom. Where there's more economic freedom, it's easier to accumulate savings and start or expand a business or find a job. This helps increase income levels, including among the poorest 10%. Another thing, where economic freedom increases, literacy rates rise. In the most free countries, literacy rates eclipse 93%, yet drop below 65% in the least free countries. And the life expectancy in countries with the most economic freedom is about 17 years longer than in countries with the least. Higher incomes, better education, longer, healthier lives. The fruits of economic freedom.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to a Newsfirst exclusive on economic freedom in Sri Lanka. We'll be talking today to Mr. Fred McMahon. He's a research fellow and also the Dr. Michael A. Walker Research Chair on Economic Freedom at the Fraser Institute, a think tank based in Canada, which also publishes the Economic Freedom of the World annual report. Mr. McMahon, thank you very much for speaking to News First on this very important topic in Sri Lanka right now. Sri Lanka jumped from 101st to 94th position, a slight improvement in 2015 in terms of economic freedom. Can you tell us a little bit about what this means for the country and what are the metrics that you use to measure economic freedom in Sri Lanka?
Well, you hit it dead on when you said slight improvement. I mean, if Sri Lanka wants to really produce prosperity and jobs for its citizens, it has to move up further than that. Individuals and families able to make their own economic decisions, start a business, work for whom they wish, become an entrepreneur. That drive and ingenuity is what has created wealth and prosperity in nations around the world, whether it's Singapore or Ireland or Chile in South America or Botswana in Africa. Economic freedom is basically the ability of the individual or the family to make their own economic decision, free of government interference, free of patronage networks, free of crony capitalism. We look at 5 areas. Size of government. If government is too big, it squeezes out the free market. The rule of law and property rights. This is absolutely the essential backbone of economic freedom, because economic freedom should be available to everyone, whether you're rich or poor, weak or powerful. And the poor and the weak are not going to have real economic freedom unless there's a rule of law to protect their rights and protect their freedom and protect their property. Sound money. Your property can be eroded by inflation every bit as easily as it can by taxation. Freedom to trade with the world. We're going to talk, I suspect, about that a little later, because Sri Lanka does absolutely horrible in this area. Sri Lanka is 135th out of the 159 nations that we measure, and declining. You need the world as your marketplace. And finally, we look at regulation. Regulation of labor. Can you work for whom you wish? Can you hire whom you wish without onerous regulations that make that difficult? Credit. Can you get a loan? Can you lend money? Business regulations. Can you start a business? Can you close a business? You'll only have real entrepreneurship not just if you can start a business, but also if you close one if it doesn't work out.
You mentioned that Sri Lanka is performing very poorly in trade, and these are some of the indicators that cause the country to be ranked so low from among the 159 countries surveyed. Sri Lanka also, in the past 2 years, has not done very well on other global indices, including the Ease of Doing Business Index and also on Transparency International's Global Corruption Perceptions Index, where the country has actually slid a few ranks in spite of change in government. Which areas has Sri Lanka performed well in order to warrant the improvement from 101st to 94th?
Well, you've got to understand that when you get down that low in the ranks, we score from a range of 0 to 10. And if you tick up maybe 0.1, you can move up in the ranks quite a bit. If you go down 0.1, you can move down in the ranks quite a bit. So forgive me for saying this, but when you're down in the basement, moving up into the 90s really doesn't mean all that much.
I'd like to talk a little bit about economic freedom. Economic freedom is essentially a liberal economics concept. This is an area of the world where traditionally there's been a lot of resistance to liberal economics, liberal market policies, etc. Do you have any clue as to why this might be and how you can overcome it?
Well, you know, I'm not sure. I'm going to use an example from India during Indira Gandhi's time in office. Somebody in Parliament, you know, and at that point in time, the regulation state, a leftist government policy, and of course the government would have said exactly what you said. Now, I know you were posing it as a question, not a statement, but, you know, people here are comfortable with big government and not free markets. So the question in Parliament was, Madam Prime Minister, why wherever you go in the world are Indians great business people and entrepreneurs? Everywhere, that is, except in India. It's not that they were not entrepreneurs. It's not that they couldn't deal with free markets. It was that the government policy was opposed to them, and people to some extent were brainwashed. So I don't believe for an instant that Sri Lankans aren't entrepreneurial, can't create jobs, wealth, and prosperity. I think it's your government holding you back, not culture. So I'd say, why are Sri Lankans successful everywhere in the world except maybe in Sri Lanka?
I'm sure there are many Sri Lankan entrepreneurs around the world as well who would agree with you. Let me ask you, when it comes to considering economic freedom around the world, what is the trend like? Are more countries working on achieving economic freedom for their citizens, or in the past few years, has it been more regressive?
During the 1970s, when economic freedom was being restricted in Canada, the United States, Britain, and much of Europe, there was a huge change in policy. And during the 1970s, economic freedom was flat, but at the end of that time, people saw the destruction in their economies. Huge unemployment rates in Canada, the United States, and much of Europe. And they moved towards economic freedom. And throughout the 80s, there was a very strong trend line up in economic freedom. And because so many countries have done so well, of course, the growth has to flatten off. I am pleased to say that despite the financial crisis of the last decade, economic freedom is continuing to rise, but not as fast as it had been during that period.
Fred, thank you very much. We're going for a short commercial break. As soon as we come back, we'll be talking more about global trends in economic freedom and also trade liberalization, the importance of trade liberalization in Sri Lanka. Welcome back to the program. We're in conversation with Mr. Fred McMahon. He's a research fellow at the Fraser Institute. We're talking about economic freedom in Sri Lanka and around the world as well. Fred, before I get into trade liberalization in Sri Lanka, I want to ask you, the global sort of political establishment, the global order, was dealt a bit of a shock when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. Has this and the sort of cry that we're seeing from a large section of the American public for more protectionist attitudes, has this sort of compromised greater economic freedom around the world?
It's a real threat to it. I mean, Donald Trump is a complete shock to the system. I mean, the United States built its great wealth and prosperity on trading to the world, on selling to the world, on buying from the world. And U.S. companies, just like Sri Lankans given freedom, U.S. companies can compete with anyone. There is absolutely no justification for what Trump is doing. Now, yes, there has been economic dislocation. That's primarily due to technology, not to competition from Mexico, not to competition from Canada. He threatens the global order, and it is extraordinarily dangerous. He could throw, or his tendency could throw, the United States and the world back economically decades. The United States did this before. In 1930, they passed the Smoot-Hawley Act, which was a protectionist act, not dissimilar from what Donald Trump wants to do. And the recession across the United States deepened into the Great Depression. Millions in the United States were thrown out of work. Tens of millions were thrown out worldwide. It destabilized the global economy and the global political system. And the results were horrendous. So, no, I'm worried about Donald Trump.
Let's move on to Sri Lanka. We were talking about the 70s early on in the program. In the 70s is when Sri Lanka, actually the late 70s rather, was when Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan government at the time sort of embraced the concept of an open economy. And this came on the back of a long period of highly protectionist government policies. This open economy concept is still a very polarizing concept in Sri Lanka. There are many who say that this was one of the greatest moments in the country's post-independence history, and there are many detractors who say that that experiment with the open economy led to the country's current predicament. Why is it that sometimes this experimentation with open economy may tend to be seen as a failure by the general public?
Well, often it's seen as a failure because all the reforms that are needed are not implemented, because there's backpedaling, and because special interests in the economy sabotage the reforms. So why are food prices in Sri Lanka higher than in India? There's no good reason for that. Let me give you the example of New Zealand. New Zealand was facing a crisis towards the end of the 1970s. They implemented deep reforms, and they stuck with them. Now, the agricultural section is the most interesting. All at once, literally overnight, the New Zealand economy removed all trade barriers for agriculture. The agriculture industry screamed like a stuck pig. But what happened? Did New Zealand's agricultural industry, without protection, fade away? Were farmers forced off the land? No. The New Zealand agricultural industry became a global force. It became an engine of wealth and growth. Its products went from being uncompetitive to the most competitive in the world. The same could happen here. So what often occurs is that the reforms are not carried out or sabotaged. When they are carried out, they're hugely successful.
So basically, to sort of summarize what my question was there in a nutshell, is that what you're saying is essentially that it's not something that you experiment with. You do it and you stick with it.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Fred, I'd also like to talk about trade liberalization in Sri Lanka. This is another area that even if the government does want to, even if it does have the will to embrace and open trade policies, there is a lot of political backlash to deal with. We're seeing protests on the streets in Colombo and all around the country, actually, against the proposed free trade agreement with India, the Economic and Technology Cooperation Agreement. There are also free trade agreements that the government has in the pipelines with Singapore, with China. How do you overcome political opposition to trade?
You try to get the facts out. I mean, psychiatrists say that you have cognizant dissonance when you believe two contrary facts at the same time. So the people who are protesting trade agreements also know in the other half of their brain that the most successful nations in the world are free traders. Wouldn't you love to have the wealth in Sri Lanka that they have in Singapore? Well, Singapore is a free trader. Wouldn't you love to have the wealth in Sri Lanka that they have in South Korea? Well, South Korea is a free trader. Wouldn't you love to have the wealth that they have in Europe? Many Sri Lankans leave for free market, free trading economies, and then they say, but that's not for Sri Lanka. Well, how do you think all these other nations grew wealthy? They didn't grow wealthy with 22 million people for a market. They grew wealthy selling to 9 billion people around the world. And so you have to educate, and also let people know that those who claim they are protesting for the good of the Sri Lankan people are protesting for their own wallets. They don't want competition. They don't want Sri Lankans to have good food prices.
The argument that comes out from a lot of the protesters, those in opposition to to open trade, is that especially in the case of trade negotiations, trade deals with bigger countries, with more powerful countries, you tend to see a more dominating attitude, and that we may have to sacrifice sovereignty in order to, if these trade deals go through. Is there any merit to this argument?
None at all. Absolutely none at all. Canada had the same debate when we entered into the free trade agreement with the United States. And the United States, in relation to Canada, is not unlike Sri Lanka in relation to India. A giant, giant country next to a tiny one. So, you know, all the anti-market people, the unionists, were out on the streets protesting, talking woe for the Canadian sovereignty, woe for the Canadian economy. And what happened? The Canadian economy took off like that after the free trade agreement with the United States. It's been so successful that all of the same unionists and leftists with Donald Trump in power are saying, whoa, it's going to be a disaster if we lose free trade with the United States. So the experience of this is amazing. Let me give you an example, by the way. I was a reporter for Canada's leading financial newspaper at the time of free trade. And the Wine Growers Council would come to me and say, Fred, look, this is horrible. We can't compete with the United States in wine. We're going to have an absolutely awful... The wine industry in Canada is going to collapse if we have free trade. What happened instead was that the wine industry in Canada, under competition, actually started producing good wine rather than bad wine. And it now employs about 10 times as many people as it did before free trade. Again, you have to get the facts out.
Fred, we're going to go in for a short commercial break. This is a Newsfirst exclusive on economic freedom in Sri Lanka in specific and globally in particular. When we come back, we'll be talking about communicating the message of economic freedom. We'll also be talking about, does economic freedom benefit people who do not own capital? Welcome back to the program. This is a Newsfirst exclusive on economic freedom in Sri Lanka and indeed around the world. We're in conversation with Mr. Fred McMahon. He's a research fellow at the Fraser Institute, which publishes the annual report on economic freedom around the world. Fred, getting back to our conversation, You were talking about how countries have become wealthy, more economically stable and powerful by embracing economic freedom. You mentioned examples of Canada, New Zealand, even in the United States. One of the key elements that sort of propelled Donald Trump into power was a lot of blue-collar workers who were complaining about liberal market policies, that this idea of embracing economic freedom had put them out of jobs, that this was not working for them, people who do not own capital. Is this idea correct? I mean, there has to be some merit to it, because it did end up in putting Mr. Trump in the White House.
The last U.S. election was a complete anomaly. Almost any candidate other than Hillary Clinton could have beaten Donald Trump. Donald Trump's anti-market policies now have the support of about 30% of the American electorate.
But he does command a lot of support from blue-collar workers, miners, etc. And we see that with a lot of politicians around the world who are willing to embrace sort of protectionist attitudes, that they do enjoy a lot of support from this segment of the workforce.
Okay, now remember that that's only 30%, so we are not talking about a large number of people. And Donald Trump can do it by spinning magical fictions. You elect me, all of a sudden you're all going to be earning $100,000 a year. All we have to do is stop those nasty Sri Lankans from selling to the United States, and all our industries are going to come back. That's a fiction. That's false. And the United States hasn't done that badly. Donald Trump is playing to the worst fears and prejudices of the American worker. The unemployment rate in the United States is around 4%. The United States income has continued to grow. Yes, it's been a little bit soft at the bottom, but it's still growing. So Donald Trump, one, is not that popular in the United States. This was not a huge mass revolt. It was basically Hillary Clinton elected Donald Trump all by herself. Donald Trump didn't do it. And secondly, he does it, frankly, by lying about economics. So there's supposed to be this great populist backlash. Well, they got defeated all across Europe. So yeah, there's some of that. You can always appeal to people's worst instincts, but we should appeal to their hope and the real evidence of what creates economic growth and prosperity.
It's important that the citizens of any country not only feel but also perceive that their economic system works for them as well, that it works for everyone. There appears to be, as you mentioned, with Europe and even in the West, there's this notion among many people, even if it is 30%, that the system is not working for them. How do you address this?
Well, by talking about facts. Leftists like to talk about how great Cuba is. You haven't seen a whole bunch of boats leaving Miami for Havana because the Cuban economic system's successful. It's a disaster. Look around Asia. What are the nations that are producing better lives for their citizens? What are the nations with low poverty rates? It's not the left-wing nations. It's Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, all nations with free market economies. And you talk about, the worst off. I've got to tell you, I would much rather be poor in Singapore than poor in Sri Lanka. In Singapore, I'm going to have a place to live. My children are going to go to school. They're going to go to a good school. I'm going to have food to eat, and I'm going to have opportunity, and my kids are going to have opportunity. So this, pardon me for putting it this way, this tripe about the least suffering the most is just that. It's tripe. You'd much rather be poor, as I say, in Singapore than in Sri Lanka. And you said, but what if you don't have any capital? Well, if you're in a closed economy, you're never going to get capital. You're never going to become an entrepreneur. It's the opportunity that's offered to the poorest that's one of the strongest marks of economic freedom.
Fred, electoral compulsions are a huge problem in adopting reforms and sticking with it.
Yes.
We've seen this in Sri Lanka. We've seen this happen in Sri Lanka back in the 70s, as I mentioned before, where certain reforms were undertaken, but then electoral compulsions forced the same government to reverse some of those reforms. And even now, there is an election on the horizon in Sri Lanka. Is it too late for this government to adopt reforms that will guarantee greater economic freedom?
I'm an economist, not a politician, and I can't really speak to the political situation in Sri Lanka. I just don't know it well enough.
In a global context, let me phrase it to you this way, in more philosophical light. Can the study of economics continue to be divorced from political realities?
I'm here with the Advocata Institute. We've also worked with the Pathfinder Institute in the past. These groups do extraordinary work in trying to educate people about what happens. Again, trying to help people look around the world and find out where folks are successful, where poverty is not a life-threatening situation, where the children of the poor go to good schools and have good health care. All the things that people here are claiming they want when they damn free markets, and yet where do you find exactly what they claim they want? In free market economies. Ireland is another marvelous example. By the way, perhaps the most free market economy in Europe, once the poorest Northern European nation, now but the rich, one of the richest nations in the world. So what these anti-free marketers claim they want for the people of Sri Lanka is what you find in countries with free markets, not without free markets. And it's important to get that knowledge, that real information, not myths and scare tactics. It's important to get the information out.
One final question before I let you go. What can greater economic freedom do, and what does it mean for Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans?
I can give you examples from around the world. The Irish turned to free markets in the late 1980s. They did it as a society-wide consensus. You had unions in Ireland calling for greater free markets. Ireland, one union leader told me before we made the reforms, Fred, it was awful. Young people would attend their graduation ceremonies, get in a taxi, go to the airport, and leave for the United States or Great Britain. Ireland at that point maybe had a third of the wealth of the United Kingdom or of Canada. Now Ireland has more free market policies than either, and Ireland, the poorest nation in Europe, is now richer than Canada or richer than the United States. Singapore was built on a spit of land that was a swamp. Look at it now. Compare South Korea, which is about 30th in the world in economic freedom. Compare the wealth there. So again, the message is that this means a lot. It means opportunity for people. It means the chance to join the formal workplace. It means having good education and a real healthcare system. And when you look around the world at the most free market economies with the highest level of economic freedom, that's what you find. You do not find those good things in closed economies, whether it's India or Sri Lanka or Pakistan or Venezuela, the disaster of South America.
Fred, thank you very much for taking time off your very busy schedule during your visit to Sri Lanka to come speak to News First regarding some key takeaways that I had from our conversation. Deal in facts, not tripe, and also reforms for economic freedom are not something that you experiment with. You have to do it. Fred, thank you once again for coming on the program. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'll see you again on Friday at 9:30 on BizFirst Review 360. Until then, take care and good luck.